May 20th is Emancipation Day in Florida. Many people have heard about Juneteenth, which is celebrated to commemorate the slaves in Galveston, Texas, who found out about the Emancipation Proclamation. But this day, May 20th in Florida, there are those who have worked very hard to make sure that this date is observed as Emancipation Day for the thousands of slaves who were held captive during slavery in Florida. My guest tonight will talk about that day and what happened on that day and what it means to us in 2021. The Timbuktu Report. Our goal is to enlighten, educate, and inspire. We will be right back. Welcome back to the Timbuktu Report. I'm Pamela Marshall. Dr. Rick Stevenson is usually our guest on Thursdays for the Timbuktu Report. Dr. Stevenson playing tennis in a tournament. Good luck to him. But tonight we are deeply honored to have as our guest Mr. Clifton P. Lewis, who is an esteemed historian in the state of Florida. He is also the founding director of the L.B. Brown House Museum in Bartow. Mr. Lewis, first of all, I know you've had a very busy day on May 20th, the Emancipation Day in Florida. So thank you very much for carving out some time to be with us here on the Timbuktu Report.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Mr. Lewis, let's just start with the concern about this day not being properly observed, or the Florida legislature recognizing Juneteenth, which is associated with Texas, and wanting to bring it all in under one date in Juneteenth, when in fact it was May 20th, 1865, when the slaves in Florida found out that they were free.
That's correct. So your question is, what's my reaction to this?
Well, just the significance of clearing this up, that some may say, well, Juneteenth is significant when the last slaves found out. Why do we need to make sure that May 20th is observed?
Yes, well, first let me mention that I absolutely do not denigrate Juneteenth. In fact, Juneteenth represents that day on June the 19th, 1865, when the slaves in Texas were set free. As a result of a lack of knowledge over the years, Juneteenth has really become a sort of a metaphor for emancipation. And I recognize that people celebrate freedom, not realizing that emancipation actually occurred at different times in different places during the 1860s. That's largely because I believe, Ms. Marshall, that we attempt to deal with the subject of emancipation with the Emancipation Proclamation absent the involvement of the Civil War. And that cannot be done. It would be like trying to explain this lockdown we're into right now without talking about the virus. We talk about the fact that the slave did not find out until June 1865 or May of 1865. That's not correct. The reason for the 2-year delay from 1863 to 1865 had very little to do with the primitive communication, because after all, there were telegraphs back then. The slave owners knew, perhaps within days, when Lincoln announced his intention to sign an Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. And not only did the slave owners know, but many of the slaves probably knew. The issue was that even though they knew, where were they going to go? What were they going to do? And finally, let me say, we tend to look at the Confederacy as if it was simply some subversive organization. The Confederacy was a separate country. They had their own president. And so the freedom didn't come till 1865, quite frankly, because the slave owners ignored Abraham Lincoln. He was not their president. Jefferson Davis was. And so the significance of all of this is about education. And why is Juneteenth important? Why is May 20th important? Because quite frankly, this is not just Black history. This is American history.
And what do you say to those who still are not interested, non-African Americans, who are still not interested in these days that are significant in the building of this country? How do we break through that and help people to understand that this is American history?
It's a lack of education. What we've had over the decades immediately following emancipation, 1870s on current time, was disinformation. Sort of like you have what's going on now regarding the January the 6th insurrection. There was a lot of disinformation, and for whatever reason, we did not do our own research. So we accepted the information we heard about the horrors of slavery, and God knows it was horrible. And the fact that Lincoln did not really want to free the slaves, and there's been just a lot of misinformation. And if we can just use these opportunities to begin to educate the populace, and I think we'll make great headway, not only in terms of learning our history, but in understanding how that history is repeating itself right now with what's going on in Washington, D.C. It smells so much like the 1860s, it's actually frightening.
When you said that they didn't recognize what Abraham Lincoln had decreed through the Emancipation Proclamation because they had their own president, talk about how that correlates with what's happening today.
Well, it only correlates in the sense that there's some folks who might not like Mr. Biden, but the reality that he is their president. The comparison is that with the Confederacy, it was a foreign country. So when we talk about the Confederate flags or other aspects of the Confederacy being a part of American history, that is not correct. The Confederate flag and what happened to the Confederacy was a part of a foreign country. The Confederacy had its own president, Jefferson Davis. It had its own Congress, 2 houses of Congress, Defense Department, Secretary of State. They had set up an entirely separate country. You can Google the Confederate States of America Constitution. It had their own Constitution, own Declaration of Independence, called the Articles of Secession. So it compares only in the sense that, we're divided, but the Confederacy was an entirely separate nation.
And as we are observing what seems unfathomable, and at some point you would think that people will understand, but if you don't understand if we don't understand the history of this country and the divisiveness that took place over keeping a group of people in a position of being owned by another group of people, then it is, if you didn't see anything wrong with that, then you don't see anything wrong with what's happening today.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
So, if you would, why do you think you all had to push so hard to get May 20th recognized by the Florida legislature, who had it in the statute for the state that Juneteenth was the day to observe?
Well, the issue with the Florida legislature, quite frankly, is the issue with us. Many of us, when I say us, I mean African Americans, not knowing the true history, wanting to honor our ancestors wanting to recognize that emancipation process, that Emancipation Day, we requested a holiday. We requested recognition. And quite frankly, we requested Juneteenth because we were not aware, I think, we were not aware that slavery occurred, emancipation that is, occurred at different times in different places. Because as the Civil War began to turn in favor of the Union, if there were no Union troops in an area to enforce the proclamation, and more importantly, to provide protection to those free slaves, because they were being shot down on the road if they left the plantation. If there were no Union troops to provide protection, the former slave, the freedmen, would be slaughtered. And so, we kind of turn away from that history because we're not familiar with it. We've allowed disinformation. We've accepted these bumper sticker comments. For example, Lincoln didn't want to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln hated black folks, and of course he did not hate black. He didn't respect us. We didn't necessarily hate us either. But there's just a lot of misinformation. And what we can do right now is to educate ourselves. Because my guess is the state legislature are probably confused. I mean, some of us are asking for Juneteenth. Others of us are saying no, but it was May 20th, 1865, when General McCook did what he did in Tallahassee. And now the legislature is somewhat confused, and they're taking advantage of that confusion. And in some cases, we're actually fighting against each other. And I wish that would stop. That's why I say I respect Juneteenth. I know what it is. It's not what everyone said. It's when the last slaves were freed. The last slaves were freed in Delaware and Kentucky. Kentucky was the last Confederate state to free the slaves, not the last state.
Well, and that's another thing. I mean, that's what I've heard all of these years was Galveston, Texas, when it was read there, that we're celebrating the last of the slaves that were free. And that's why it is critical that we read and that we tell our own story so that it is accurate. My guest tonight is Mr. Clifton Lewis, who is the founder of the L.B. Brown House in Bartow, the L.B. Brown House Museum. L.B. Brown was a former slave. Tell us about the significance of this museum and the stories that are told from there, Mr. Lewis.
I'm glad you asked. Your viewers would be very interested to know that L.B. Brown, having been born in 1856 in slavery, would have experienced that whole emancipation process on May 20th, 1865. But why your viewers would be happy is that L.B. Brown was born in Archer, Florida, Alachua County, just up the way from where you are right now. So the man who has put Bartow on the map, whose home is being, celebrated almost throughout the country, is an Alachua County native. So,
wow.
Talk about educating folks. So we need to, and you know what, Ms. Marshall, I spoke to my board about this recently. As much as we complain about what they are not doing, here we are, have the homestead that was built and owned by Mr. Brown. And yet we do not have a marker or a monument here describing how emancipation occurred in Florida. And that's something that we're going to correct pretty quick. I mean, we have a monument about Mr. Brown, but we make no reference to his enslaved birth. And so this whole education process begins with us. I mean, we can become educated because what we're telling the legislature, it's not correct. And let me just mention quickly, there were 15 slave states. 11 of them left the Union and formed the Confederacy. That included Florida, 11. 4 of those slave states were not Confederate states: Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. They were slave states, but they were not part of the Confederacy. And so when Lincoln did what he did, it was strictly as a war measure. He said in the proclamation it was military necessity why he issued that proclamation. And we need to understand that. As you mentioned, we should read it, but we should read it with guidance. For example, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, it mentioned that one of the areas that he excluded was the 48 counties of West Virginia. That really should read the 48 county of Western Virginia. There was no state of West Virginia in 1863. That came about later. Those 48 counties came about later. So that's what I'm saying, that reading the proclamation and other aspects of history is sort of like reading the Bible. You need a good commentary.
And so, as you said, it is incumbent upon us as people of color to make this significant, because if it's not significant to us, then why is it significant to anybody else?
Absolutely, absolutely correct. And we should not be too dogmatic about it. I mean, we should get the information wherever we could find it. We've been, as Dr. Woodson said, we've been miseducated over the years. We've been miseducated, and we've become somewhat defensive about that miseducation.
We're talking about May 20th today, which is Emancipation Day in Florida. That day has been observed in Tallahassee originally, and now it's starting to spread across the state. What does that mean for the entire state of Florida? I mean, we hear about Florida leading the number of lynchings that took place. We hear the stories of Rosewood and other stories. And as a matter of fact, we're coming up on the anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. These days, or this commemoration like this, how significant is this, the significance of these days playing in 2021 in America's history?
Yeah. And the awful thing about this is that I've got an interruption right now. Someone has just walked in on the Zoom conversation and is drawing my attention away. And excuse me 1 minute, please.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. One of my board members not aware of, and I'm on air. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. It's live TV.
I should have locked the door, I guess. But I thought I was isolated by myself. I apologize. Please reframe your question.
Oh, just as we are coming up on the anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street, of course, here close to Gainesville, we have Rosewood. As we are recognizing May 20th outside of Tallahassee, because it's been recognized there, and spreading to other communities. Here in Gainesville, they had a ceremony this morning with Miss Vivian Fowler and Mayor Lauren Poe, and then there is an event on the 22nd. As this is spreading across the state, what does this do for race relations, you think? Or how does it help to facilitate better race relations in Florida?
Oh boy. Speaking of the destruction of Black Wall Street and all, and what's happening now, a study of the whole emancipation process, the whole emancipation journey from the Reconstruction era down to the Jim Crow period, to later, we find that Black Wall Street was one of the most notable incidents, and of course, Rosewood, very notable. But there were so many instances where our people found themselves taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, not because of some act of nature, but because man's inhumanity to man, where groups largely of white Klansmen, of white regulators, white groups that would destroy not only individuals, but whole communities. This is nothing new. If we study that period, we would find out that this is consistent. And I honestly believe that there may even be some whites who are not completely aware of how consistent this has been ever since our people stepped out into that uncertain freedom. It's nothing new. It is very consistent. We talk about getting America back on track. In terms of race relations, America has never been on track. So we need to try to work to get it on track, not back on track. I mean, it might sound like a play on words, but I was born in 1942, And it's very frightening what I see right now. We're going backwards, and I think if we study that whole history, emancipation, and then of course, if I can add, in addition to all the tragic events that we'll discover, we're going to find some pretty wonderful things happen. You take our hero, Lawrence Brown, the Alachua County native, born in slavery with nothing that he owned. By the time he died in 1941, Mr. Brown was worth over $500,000. He owned Lord Bartow. I mean, how did that happen? Very little, if any, education, formal education. And we would discover not only Lawrence Brown, but a lot of Lawrence Brown. And it would embolden our young people, I believe, to be all that they can be if you look at our history.
What are you doing, Mr. Lewis, to help share this love, this passion that you have with the next generations? Because you care, you walk around with a lot here and here. How do you pass that on so that that continues?
You know, with what's going on now in our country, I as a 78-year-old, been through a lot. I reluctantly say I'm really, really, really frightened for where we are right now. I talk to my children and grandchildren, continue to tell them to be all that they can be. A daughter is a lawyer, my other daughter works for the Secret Service. I mean, so my kids are pretty well established. Son is a school teacher, daughter's a beautician, but yet our country is going backwards, and I don't want to plant negative seeds in their heads, but they have to be prepared for what's happened. These voter suppression activities and all the things going on is very, very frightening. And on top of that, we have the pandemic, where we really don't know where the job market is going and the housing market is going. And so, as a grandfather, I have to admit, I scratch my head, I pray over it, hope that I'm giving my kids the right advice. I'm frightened right now.
That is interesting that you would use the word frightened in 2021 as we talk about what happened in 1865, May 20th, 1865, when people were told that they were free, didn't have anywhere to go, didn't have any education, didn't have any jobs, and some were welcomed to stay on the plantation, and some did because that's all they knew. And in 2020, an African-American man in Florida, in the United States of America, still feeling uncomfortableness for your children, for your grandchildren, for your great-grandchildren, for African-Americans as a whole. What does that say about where we have not, we say we have come a long way, but we have so much further to go. How many more times do we get to say that? When does that change? How do we bring about that change? I should do one question at a time, huh, Mr. Lewis?
That is a great question. I feel like the things you said, the answer is blowing in the wind. I really wish I had a concrete answer to that philosophical question. I can really talk about what happened during Emancipation and May 20th and June 10th, but just to kind of give people advice in broad terms, right now I'm reaching. I'm trying to come to grips with it myself, so I make sure I give my own family, my church family, my community family the right kind of advice.
So why is this significant as we make these strides to move forward? Why not just do it on June 19th? Why do we need to do it on May 20th?
Well, we need to know accurate history. I think that the fact is that what happened in Florida was unique, because, as I said, almost each state had its unique experience. You may be interested to know that on April 16, 1862, Abraham Lincoln and Congress freed 3,000 slaves in the District of Columbia in 1862, before he did the Emancipation Proclamation. That freedom was done by legislation. And also, the slaveholders there received $1 million in compensation. So that was the only place where compensation was paid for free slaves, which incidentally was the way Lincoln wanted all the slaves to be freed. because he felt that if for 1 year of a war expenditure could probably buy the slaves. And so he wanted compensated and gradual emancipation after he ditched the idea of colonization. But so if we just learn these different experiences of what happened to Mr. Brown, how he became so successful, how did Frederick Douglass achieve what he did, become such an outstanding, not only orator, but a statesman. When folks questioned whether he was writing his own peace articles and all, and he went overseas and started writing and clearly demonstrated he was indeed writing his own with absolutely no formal education. So we discovered these people, not only Dr. King, who did have a great deal of formal education, but who was so bright, and so many other women and men down in our past that I think can inspire us to do better, to reach higher heights. But at the same time, to understand that when we say that if we don't know history, it can repeat itself, it's not just a cliche. It can, and indeed right now it is.
May 20th, 1865, when the Emancipation was read in Tallahassee, it's my understanding that there were 9,000 slaves in Tallahassee, 2,000 citizens. So you had more slaves in Tallahassee than you did citizens.
Yes.
Mr. Lewis, can you paint a picture from your research on what that day was like for the slave, whether it happened on May 20th for them or June 19th or later dates as it did in Kentucky and Delaware? Take us to those moments when the slave found out that they had been freed.
Well, yes, I'm glad you asked. That imbalance in the numbers actually was pretty general throughout the South. The state of South Carolina, I believe, had 70% was 70% black. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, I think, was at least 60% black. So the Tallahassee experience was not unique. There were, and that's why there was such violence to try to force the blacks to leave, either by lynchings or forcing them to migrate, as Ms. Wilkerson said, in the warmth of other sons, trying to push them out of here because there were so many of them. What was it like? Really, it occurred on January the 1st. Now, January the 1st was when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think these other emancipation things probably were pretty typical. When news arrived and Frederick Douglass heard about it, he called the proclamation a momentous decree, and he said that Emancipation Day should be remembered as if it was 1,000 years. A white slaveholder in Maryland declared that news of Mr. Lincoln's proclamation, he said, struck the nation like a thunderbolt from a cloudless sky. A black preacher who was with Frederick Douglass said, "May God forget my people if they forget this day." And so we look back on it now with 150 years of hindsight, and we look for equality and fairness and all the other things that we are entitled to. But back then, as Frederick Douglass says, it wasn't all of those things the slaves were looking for. They were looking for the trump of Jubilee, just to be free, and then they would work the other things out later. And so if we could just focus on what it was like back on that day. And then, of course, Lincoln took a lot of hits. But when Lincoln signed that proclamation on January 1st, he said, this will be the principal act of my administration and the main event of the 19th century. And he went on to say, I have never been more certain that I was doing right as I feel now. If I ever go down in the history books, it will be for this act. And he added, my whole soul is in it. Lincoln did not think much of the black slave, but he detested slavery. And so he really wanted to free those slaves. He didn't want to do it by executive order, which he was forced to do, much like what's going on now with the Dreamers and all. What President Obama did is almost identical to Abraham Lincoln. Obama begged them to pass legislation taking care of these Dreamers. When they refused repeatedly, he did an executive order. That's exactly what Lincoln did. He begged Congress to free the slaves. They wouldn't do it. And so he did it by executive order. But it wasn't just to free the slave. That Emancipation Proclamation was designed primarily to end the Civil War. It was the equivalent of when we dropped the bomb in World War II to get their attention. And he did just that. The Emancipation Proclamation did everything it was intended to do and more. And it was just an exciting time for the slaves at that time. Now, of course, Lee surrendered on April the 9th, 1865. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He did not, on April the 14th, Good Friday, he did not have time a chance to guide his proclamation or his Reconstruction program through. He was killed. And so things started unraveling, and Andrew Johnson he was not a Lincoln, and things came apart, much like with President Obama's health plan. When Secretary Clinton did not win, the health thing went to hell in a basket, which is the same thing happened to the whole emancipation process, and which I think people should know that. Lincoln, I think, if he had lived, it would have been an entirely different outcome.
Do you think that people are hearing, or they have so bought into a message that it doesn't matter what anybody says, they have put their proverbial heels in, and they're going to believe what they want to believe?
Well, I think if we educate ourselves, I chatted with a young lady who, believe it or not, was working on a master's degree in history. He said to me that the Emancipation Proclamation was a worthless document. It did absolutely nothing. It freed no slave. And I was a bit taken aback. She was a well-meaning young lady. My question to her was, if the proclamation didn't free any slaves, what did? She said, well, the 13th Amendment. I said, do you celebrate Juneteenth, May 20th? Yes. I said, well, aren't you saying that Juneteenth was when the last slave, Confederate, was freed? Yeah. Well, what freed them? It was the Emancipation Proclamation. There was no 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was ratified 6 months after Juneteenth. So it's fair to say that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slave. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. They're two sides of the same coin. That document, along with the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence, is that proverbial third leg that used to hold up the freedom of this country. I am concerned with what's going on now. But that was a powerful document, what Lincoln did. When he said the principal act of his administration, people don't realize that Lincoln expanded the banking system, expanded the railroad, started development of telegraph. There was a lot that happened during Lincoln's 1.5 terms. But he said that proclamation was his number one achievement. And
he felt it in his soul, and it cost him his life.
It absolutely. John Wilkes Booth, almost within days after Lee surrendered, when he heard Lincoln make a speech from the White House balcony, he said this would be the last speech he will ever make. Booth was a well-known actor, but he was a Confederate sympathizer, and he just could not settle on the fact that the South had lost. And not only did Booth had a negative reaction, but how many of your viewers know that somewhere around February or March of 1865, when word reached the Tallahassee state capitol that the governor was going to eventually have to surrender the state to the Union, that Governor John Milton went to the state legislature. You can Google this and check it out. John Milton, Confederate governor. He went to the state legislature and said, death is preferable to reunification. He drove to his farm and blew his brains out.
What?
How often is that talked about? Is that a staunch segregationist? Is that a staunch Confederate? This is not taught anywhere. Google it. Governor John Milton, Florida. That was in around about March of 1865, I believe, just before the May 20th event.
Wow. I'm speechless on that. these stories, this part of American history that does not get told. And thank God for people like you, Mr. Clifton Lewis, in Bartow at the L.B. Brown House Museum. I look forward to coming there. Miss Vivian Fowler here in Gainesville, who is one of the founding members of the Cotton Club, where there will be a celebration on the 22nd commemorating May 20th. And the goal is for every community in Florida to observe this day as the day that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the Negro, the Black African in the state of Florida from the bondage of slavery. Mr. Lewis, again, thank you so very much for joining us. And Dr. Royal Colbert said fantastic information that all of us as African Americans should know. So I encourage all who watch this show, share it, because there is such power in knowledge. And with all of your friends, with your community, your social network, because as was said on Fred Sanford by Aunt Esther, the truth shall set you free. And that's where we are today. The emancipation did what it could do. Now we need truth to set us free. Mr. Clifton Lewis, again, thank you so very much for joining us, and continue to encourage truth to be told.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I look forward to coming to your museum and hearing from you some more. As a matter of fact, we should just do something on your museum. Will you come back and visit with us?
I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at what that native son of yours achieved here in Bartow. We have some of his artifacts. In fact, we have some of his diaries going back to the 1890s. I mean,
wow.
Mr. Brown made terrific notes, haircut contract, rent-to-own contracts. I mean, it's amazing. It's his own handwriting, original stuff. And as I said, it's an Archer native.
And it dispels all the myths about the Negro not being educated and not being capable. And I think that's what these communities that were burned down also represent. They wanted to wipe that out of history so that a story of being trifling and lazy and worthless could be told. But when people did achieve, they experienced domestic terrorism here in the United States for their achievement.
Yes.
Continue to tell the stories. We thank you all so much for joining us for this edition of the Timbuktu Report, where our goal is to enlighten, inspire, and topping the list is to educate. We will be back here next Thursday at 7 p.m. We certainly hope that you will join us, share, and like. For all of us here at the Timbuktu Report, I'm Pamela Marshall at the Wellness Radio TV and at the Wellness Radio TV podcast. Remember, there is healing at the well. We'll see you next time.